Such a nice turnout. Jason asked me to speak a little bit about poetry and Buddhist practice and the relationship, and mostly I'll probably read poems and make some comments on them. I really want to thank Jason for having taken the initiative to bring me up to Seattle. I've been here a number of times and always come away enriched with friendships, and today Jason's class, which was quite terrific, wonderful questions, and I'm going to, after that rousing introduction by Jason, maybe read a poem to open, just to keep also a little bit of humility about all of this. I don't know how many of you may have read anything by the formidable Buddhist scholar Edward Kanza, who really dedicated his life to the Prajnaparamita, or perfection of wisdom literatures. This is a poem based on an anecdote I heard. It's a true story. It's a true story. I may say a little more about it at some point. Thus have I heard. Once the eminent Buddhist scholar Edward Kanza, known for his translations of perfect wisdom, visited UC Santa Cruz to lecture. He spent the entire period lambasting those who thought Buddhist insight might be achieved by eating organic food, walking barefoot, burning incense, or otherwise assuming outward display rather than the fierce study required by intricate old texts, sutras which demand many decades of devoted meditation to yield up their secrets. At the end of the lecture, one young, barefooted man at the back of the room, thanking the visitor for his insights, inquired, "Dr. Kanza, could you say a word on the role of arrogance in Buddhist practice?" "Arrogance," snapped the scholar. "Arrogance is the last fetter to drop away." It's a true story. You can pick that up out of Kanza's books a little bit. The hand that shapes the mind, clay or written word, is subject to accident and time. Finding it is the meander. They say purity or straight lines let troublesome spirits arrive. The good teacup has a flaw. It wobbles. The avant-garde continues. An exotic, not very hardy species survives in greenhouse environments, academia, the so-called art world, the gallery ghettos. Once outside, it tends to shrivel and die, sheer irrelevance. On the phone, a message, nearly a year old. I intend to keep it, my dead father's voice. It may help me imagine a new kuksu, a bird mask to cover, or is it sheepishly disclose a lifetime of error, accidental design in the imprint? An Arapaho verb, nesehi, to be wild. There go 4 early morning doe on thin hooves through autumn-colored grasses, verbs for animate or inanimate things. It's a cosmology, like Indo-European makes words male, female, neuter. Nesehi's animate, act spontaneous, travel far, take risks, be alone. Live where nature edges in. Don't let nobody mess with you. Be skeptical of things, not careless. Let's sharpen and oil the tools. Watch our comrades. Tell stories. cover her breasts and belly with arnica oil, then nitohu, also animate, will make wild animal noises, whimper, cry, human whistling, a speech the deer understand. I've thought a lot over the years of this question of poetry and Buddhist practice or any kind of religious practice, and I've also listened to a lot of people talk about it. It's something that's very, very hard to articulate. There have been, where I teach at Naropa University, quite a few panels addressing Buddha Dharma and the practice of poetry, or meditation, or contemplative practice of any sort, and poetry. And most of the discussion tends to clothe itself in metaphors and work around any kind of central influence back and forth. I've come to think that quite a lot of it may have to do with what in Sanskrit would be called pratitya samutpada, or in sort of modern Buddhist vernacular, interdependence or interdependent co-origination, that phenomena arise in confluence with one another, and that each phenomenon is based on many, many prior phenomena. My friend Norman Fisher, who is a Zen teacher, for instance, points out that while we all love the idea of first thought, best thought for poetic practice or spontaneous composition, in fact, there is no first thought. Every thought has its antecedents and arises out of somewhere, except possibly, in certain very rarefied spiritual states. I don't really know, but I think interdependence would be one of the features that I try to work with in my poetry, or some kind of emergent co-origination. Because I've worked for a long time with Sanskrit, I like to go back to early Sanskrit poets. I'm going to read some translations by a poet who was probably 7th century. Dating is very hard in old India. This is a poet named Bhartrhari, who sort of walks out of the mists of anonymity into the history books in 671 or thereabouts, when a Chinese pilgrim named I Ching went down into India looking for Buddhist texts, and ended up at the great vihara, or sort of university monastery called Nalanda, and heard word of a poet who was also a linguist and a Buddhist named Bhartrhari. And Bhartrhari had been dead sometime, which I Ching gave as 20 years, but it could have been 300 or 400 years, really. Nobody is really clear. But I'd like to read some translations of Bhartrhari. I should say that there are 2 Bhartrharis in Indian literature and lore. One was a quite formidable linguist, and one was a poet. And the only early testimony we have that they're the same person comes from the Chinese pilgrim. And there's no reason to think that he was not both a poet and a linguist. He spent a lot of time, judging by his poems, doing the only thing that an overeducated, underpaid scholar of his day could, which was to work for the wealthy, warlords really, who used him and other poets as ornaments to decorate their courts really. And the lore with Bhartrhari is that 7 times he vacillated between life as a paid courtier for a probably arrogant and insensitive warlord, as a kind of ornament of the court, and life as a spirit, as a hermit. And every time he went off to the woods to pursue the life of a hermit, he missed society and he went back. And every time he got back to the courts, he eventually was overcome by a great revulsion for a life that was based on status and wealth and ownership of things, and he would leave for the forest again. And then there's Interesting story that the final conversion came because he was in love with a woman at the court, and he had a magical object. Nobody knows what the object was, a talisman or amulet of some sort, and he gave it to her. She turned out to be in love with somebody else and gave this magical object to him. But he was in love with another woman and gave it to her. And she was in love with Bhartrahari and gave it back to him when he stood there looking at his amulet. And the cycle of unrequited love and ignorance and illusion and frustration and, unrequited desire, he said, "That's it, I'm going, finally." These are from Bhartrahari Sanskrit. "Once I was bit by a snake, scaly and muscular. It stretched, coiled, gleamed like a blue water lily. I never saw its eyes. Physicians with miracle cures seemed everywhere when it struck. But if I'm struck by a woman's soft eyes, no surgeon can help. Herbs don't, ointments don't." A human life is measured at 100 years. Night takes half of it. Childhood claims a portion, so does age. The time that's left you spend serving others. You get sick. Love affairs crumble. It's what Buddhists call dukkha. Getting through life is navigating a turbulent river. Rocks, shoals, unseen reefs. Can joy come over its waters? Bhartrahari, as a linguist, has two very, I think, significant discoveries he made. They're not even the ones he's best known for, but one is that words have no meaning. The only thing that has meaning, he said, are complete utterances. It could be one word, but really it's the complete statement that you make that has meaning. And to try to abstract out words or phrases or individual fragments of grammar, really those have no meanings at all. So this was a discovery he had made more than 1,000 years really before Western linguists got onto a sort of similar sense of speech acts and word utterances and things. The other thing that Bhartrahari is known for is what has been called the Bhartrahari paradox, and it runs something like this. This cannot be said. Or, another iteration would be, these words have no meaning. Or, you cannot read this statement. But it's a great language paradox that we have, that we can actually speak things that cannot be said, or is it that we can't say things that we actually can read or write? Anyhow, Bhartrahari, as a poet, was one of the strong characters of Sanskrit, and I'll say a little bit more about him in a few minutes. Here's a few more poems of his. At night, a mouse chewed a hole in a wicker basket. It dropped into the jaws of a snake crammed inside, weak with hunger. Restored by the creature's flesh, the snake slipped free through the little hole. Stay within yourself. Fate acts. No one can see what makes a person rise or fall. As a poet, Bhartrahari really thought karma was the guiding force of the universe, and his poems are scored with a sense of this. It makes sense that he was first heard of at Nalanda University, which was a great Buddhist sort of epicenter of North India for about 1,000 years. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may have even visited it. It's a very important pilgrimage place for people who travel in India. good to see Sarnath, the sort of deer grounds where Buddha gave his first sermon. Nalanda, which was a great Buddhist university, one of a string of Buddhist universities across northern India. Nobody knows where the name Nalanda comes from. One version is that it was the name of a serpent or a naga that lived in one of the lotus ponds on the ground. The other is sort of etymologizing it, and it would mean na alam da, or something along the line of not enough giving or not sufficient generosity, and was actually a name given to a great patron of Nalanda who couldn't be satisfied no matter how much he gave to the university. And I like to think that in our current era where little universities are suffering everywhere for funding, that at some point we're going to have great figures emerge out of this inequity of wealth that we have and discover that there isn't enough giving that they can do. Prajapati stirred up the wind, food for snakes, harmless and easily had. Wild animals chew plants. They sleep on the ground with ease. For humans, he made a different way, designing our spirits to cross samsara's stormy froth. Go that way. It's a matter of character. Samsara is the Sanskrit Buddhist term for the sort of rounds of life and death. Etymologically, it means something like falling into the river and getting swept away. In Bhartrahari's day, this was one of the great concerns of how to protect yourself from, the sort of turbulent life we were getting through, and how best to navigate it. But there are impediments all along the way, and this is a poem of his about the impediments. If I crush gravel hard enough, I might extract sesame oil. Thirsty enough, I could draw water out of a desert mirage. Someday I will travel far and locate the legendary rabbit horn. But to appease the mind of a fool, that's beyond me. Rabbit horn is, an old image. I think you find it in the poems of Han Shan, the great Chinese Tang Dynasty poet who was translated by Gary Snyder. Rabbit horn sort of stuck around Asia for quite a few hundred years as, effectively impossibility, a great paradox, along with turtle fur. There is lamplight, there is fire, planets, stars, even a moon. Without my lady's soft, feral eyes, this hopeless world is dark. Driving rain. The lovers can't leave their quarters. Weather's cold, shivery. The long-eyed lady cradles him deep in her hips. Fine raindrops edged with frost blow in the window after love and soothe their fatigue. A storm-tossed day. What a good one when you're luckily nested in a lover's warm clasp. I've been tracking Sanskrit for some time, and in 1991 I published my first book of Sanskrit translations, and they were published by an outfit here in Seattle called Broken Moon Press. They went out of business maybe 10 years later, but it was, I had tried several different publishers, including the formidable New Directions, East Coast publisher, sort of the cathedral of poetry that published Ezra Pound and H.D. and William Carlos Williams and all sorts of folk, and then a whole other generation, including Robert Creeley and Gary Snyder and Denise Levertov and Bob Kaufman. And New Directions turned down the manuscript saying, the poets all sound too much like one another. And this is, something that I think we insufficiently appreciate about old cultures, that there was often a premium on sounding like one another and working within certain interesting constraints. And when a poem really emerged, it had a very special flavor because of the constraints. And the constraints might be formal, or they might have to do with themes that were being worked or something. The book was called Dropping the Bow, Poems from Ancient India. And it has a small historical significance, I think of, because the Academy of American Poets gave it their award in translation that year. The Academy of American Poets is still claimed by Wikipedia to be the preeminent organization in North America dedicated to poetry. But the real significance, I think, was it was the first time that the Academy had recognized a book of translations from Asian poetries. All the previous poems had been narrowly within the realm of Europe. So there were plenty of classical Greek and some Latin and German and Spanish and French and Italian. But I think, this sort of enlarging sense of poetry is not just being held by European languages, but other languages too. And that book had not just Sanskrit, but a number of vernacular languages, or what in India were called Prakrits. Sanskrit means something like formalized and polished or constructed, and Prakrits were really, the etymology would be pre-created or pre-put together. In other words, vernaculars, dialects, and that sort of thing. I'll read a few more Bhartrharis to get some more of his flavor in here. Old saying, so long as jealousy darkens the heart of a woman in love, no Malabar wind, no scent of sandalwood. When I knew a thing or two, pride kept me blind. I was a rutting buck, mind so stained, believed I know everything. Then bit by bit I approached the truly wise-minded and saw myself a fool. Pride was a fever that finally broke. Mind so stained it believed I know everything. This was a tricky one to translate. The actual word in Sanskrit is sarvagna, which also is an epithet often used in Prajnaparamita literature for the Buddha. So another translation would have been, when I knew a thing or two, pride kept me blind. I was a rutting buck, mind so stained it believed I'm a Buddha. I wandered rough, dirty countries and got nothing in return. Gave up family ties, clan, property to perform thankless labor for the rich. Ruining my pride, I ate in other men's courtyards, stooped over like a fucking crow. Greed, you just widened your jaws and fed on my ugly karma. Not even gratified now. He could be very curmudgeonly in his poetry, as that poem attests. And then he could turn around and write something like this. Avoid killing, not to covet the wealth of others, to speak truth. Give money when you can. Stay silent about your escapades with young women. Resist the ongoing surge of desire. Praise teachers. Give kindness to every creature. This unobstructed path is the highest, all the books say. Scholars have long thought or spoken of Bhartrhari as a Vedantist or a Hindu of some sort, because he has several poems to Shiva, but I see no reason to think that he couldn't have been maybe what we would now call a multiple belonger. He could work with both the Vedantic traditions or Brahmanic traditions and the Buddhist traditions, and recognizing that it was really in the service of speaking some truth through his poetry. And he could use mythologies, he could use fables, he could use riddles, he could use even little things that are like Aesop fables. This is one that I particularly appreciate. The dog waggles its hind end, paws at the dirt, squirms on the ground and exposes its face and belly for a scrap. But the bull elephant has a steady eye. He only eats after 100 requests. If you've studied a little bit of Indian Buddhism, you'll also know that the elephant was a common symbol for Buddha himself or for a Buddhist bhikkhu or bhikkhuni, a monk or a nun. So the bull elephant having that steady eye. And another poem that is sort of on the same theme, a little more fleshed out, a little bit less fable-like. Take a skull from a village or holy grove, fit its inner rim with white cloth. On the outskirts of town, head toward the black, thick smoke where old-time Brahmins perform the sacrifice. Each door you pass, ask for handouts, for your empty belly. It's a proud man's life, better than going every day to whine to your relatives. And one more of his. They live among rich people. Being poor makes them miserable. Consumed with things to own, their minds pursue trifles. I finish morning meditation and reflect on the old life. My heart breaks open happily. I'm perched on a rock in a wilderness grotto. Well, I've trekked the Sanskrit a long time, and it took me quite a while really to get to Bhartrhari. I think his poems are, kind of seasoned taste in a way. It took me a long time to really sort of dig down into his poetics and his thinking, and then especially to see that he was not, easily pigeonholed in one way or another. And very, very little is known about him. One thing that I discovered as I began to look into him, manuscripts of Bhartrhari are said to be the most common secular manuscripts found in India. And a Indian scholar who goes by the name D.D. Kosambi, 2 letters D.D., in the 1940s decided to finally edit a real Bhartrhari Bhartrhari collection, and he examined, out of 3,000 manuscripts he heard of, he looked at about 400. And he isolated 200 poems that seemed to show up in all the manuscripts, and there were another 500 or 600 that showed up in certain manuscripts and not others. The really interesting thing is that Kosambi was a mathematician and a historian and a doctrinaire Marxist. and he disliked Sanskrit poetry because it was not, he thought, a revolutionary art. And by that he defined a revolutionary art as an art being produced by people who are establishing new modes of production and distribution. And the Sanskrit poets, because they were mostly courtiers and scholars of various sorts, he didn't see as revolutionaries. The thing that's curious to me is that he spent 3 years of his life and impoverished himself, on his own nickel, really, putting together this manuscript of Bhartrhari and dedicated it with a Sanskrit dedication to the three Tejaswin, three luminaries of the modern world, Marx, Engels, and Lenin, which is, sort of a kick, really. And then you go back and read these poems, and I can only think that what he really liked about Bhartrhari was that Bhartrhari had, like him, lived as an impoverished scholar with a spiritual bent, and had felt himself a little bit at the mercy of the economics of his day, and had dared to, what we now call, speak truth to power. So this will be a little bit of speaking truth to power, maybe. It's a gentle poem, but it still has some richness to it. And it's addressed to the man who must have been his patron for a while, Raja, or king. King, no one in this world has reached the end of the ocean of craving. Money is what, though, when youth, strength, desire are drained from the body? Shouldn't we head home to our wives, their eyes blooming like white and blue water lilies, before age has chewed up our lives? So those are, some of the poems from Sanskrit. And, I think seasoned ones. I'm always reminded of one of the first Chinese poets, well-known, Tao Qian, who was described by an early colleague. His poems are like chewing on old wood when you're young. But as you age, they take on more and more flavor. And I think Bhartrhari is a little bit like chewing on old wood. But the flavor gets to you after a while. I think of him as very much like the Han Shan that we know through Gary Snyder and other translators, Red Pine, Burton Watson, various people, as somebody who's back there, surrounded by legend. We're not really quite clear who he was, where he lived, what conditions he lived under. The tales are gripping, and the poems are full of problems for scholars, which is a fun thing, actually, and have often been either held in a way by scholars who don't know what to do with them, or have been surrounded by a lot of commentary that may not be too accurate to them. I was recently listening to Gary Snyder speak about his Han Shan translations, which he did back in the 1950s, and he said when he went to China, he found that most of the scholars he met were baffled. Why is Han Shan so well known? Here in China, we don't really think very much of him, but he's probably the best known Chinese classical poet in America. And I think Bhartrhari is well known in India. He was even used for quite a while in the school systems, but I think he was often used as a kind of apologist for certain cults or something. Cults, religions, religious traditions, and that there's a lot more richness to him there. And going through his poetry, I discovered quite a lot of words that are very familiar very quickly from anybody who studies Buddhism, including the Sarvagnya for Buddha and words like Trishna, craving, or Samsara, the great river that we get tossed into. I'd like to read some poems now of my own to some extent. A number of years ago, I took up the study of the Arapaho language, hoping to get closer to the bioregion I live in by studying something of a language that had held the weather patterns, the landforms, the animals, the plants, for a much longer time than Spanish, French, English, or any of the other languages that were relative newcomers. And I thought, having worked decades on Sanskrit, I'd be all set. But in fact, Arapaho threw me completely. As I joke in one of my poems, well, let's say, in English we have three persons, okay? We have, first person, I or myself, second person, you, third person, he, she, or it. And Arapaho has a fourth person. I've never been able to figure it out. But in the stories, Coyote has no trouble mastering the fourth person in Arapaho. So that's humbling for me, is that other creatures in the bioregion, are able to work with this language in ways I can't possibly. Thick fog, quarter moon, the great dictionary, the 1,000 lunar journey companion. What is the dark crater? What the pa we ro piku? Set into the front of my head antlers. Antler research, I call it. Always on the track of something. Protect men and cattle. Oldest 3-word poetry prayer. That I will say something about. The oldest Indo-European phrase or hypothetical phrase or phrase that can be sort of tracked back to a hypothetical Proto-Indo-European language seems to have been a prayer that spans the entire Indo-European world. And it was 3 words, really. Protect men, cattle. I don't know if you have the same cattle fetish here in Washington State that we do in Colorado, with the ranching industry holding an outsized political power. But I think this goes way, way, way back in our metaphysical language because, the sort of cattle cult, which you can find in the myth of the Minotaur in Crete, you can find enshrined in ways in the Spanish bullfight, you can find in our own Marlboro Man, and goes way, way back. This sense of and in India, the sacred cow or the sacred cattle. Wild animal names are taboo in our mouths. Eti no ti o u. I am going to look for it. Linguists call it taboo replacement. We say racks instead of antlers. The visitor from up north. Eti ne ye no. I'm going to try to kill it. Deformation is my form of research. Thick fog, April moon. If the stream runs shallow, the water looks murky. Give the book one superfluous word, it will not survive. People these days strive for surface effect, trickery, gimcrack. Hold something back, the poem can go deep into history. If mountains stand high enough, earth ripples with ling. Look at shapes that got twisted, places the rock or soil surged in curious ways. Earth resisted the pressure of lava. Granite thrust out of sandstone. Rigatoni's the mode of late morning. Ice on Indian peaks. We step through the watershed, rhythm, music, and time. On the map, only Laramie and Prince Albert have same sun time as here. To have hold of some power, a gift of the animal world, Ni henne hathit. That's not how to say it. 2 petals up, 3 lobes beneath. Skull cap, white bee balm. Spicy oils make the body sweat, cleanse the blood, give hide and hair uncommon fragrance. Such things occur freely in the family of mint before ritual binds it. A mounting unease. Can you safely use terms from so many languages? I Ching says to stay modest, act with respect. The right foot gave out as I stepped from the cabin. The carton of books strewn in the mud. Have I broken my foot? Broken trust with the unseen sources of life? The thing about artifacts, tools, songs, meddling is always a risk. How do you handle strange vowels? I lifted a couple of lines about John from the title poem and slipped them into my own. Handled old words at times the way you'd shy from a hoard of bones, testing the glottal stop. The syntax coils in its parfleche. How cool a distance my friend keeps in his poetry. Back there, away over there in the past, a burial site. American Dipper's an animate noun, nests in the waterfall. A sign the creek's in good shape. Could have gotten flowers or incense, taken a song there. Police report, the road he went on. Chibti, pass it along. The right foot's broken, in the spirit world too. Bright eyes where we keep the stars. She moves down the road, flanks of a panther, curled in each other's skin at night, painfully vulnerable, the acrid odor, graphics on her stretched skin, and sexual tinctures, the ho-e-yaw. Did you break your foot? Did I hear that correctly? I was dozing off and somebody told me, or did I dream it? And what does it mean? My old mother, fur, hoofs, sticks, strings, bells. A considerable number of objects are decorated according to dreams. I really, when I began to study some of these old languages, began to get very fearful about it. And the moment that I got fearful, I went and consulted the I Ching with my partner who had spent many, many years studying that. And the I Ching did say, be careful, stay modest, be gentle. And 20 minutes later, I broke my foot. And this gave me a certain kind of, conundrum. I didn't know if the message was, this is a test, will you get through it? Or this is not the way to go. And I wrote to the poet Rosemary Waldrop on the East Coast, who I knew had worked with the Narragansett language some. And she wrote back and said, this is important work, keep doing it. And so I continued, but often very uneasily. And I found many, many different languages beginning to come into the poems. And found the word hoard emerging in unusual ways. And what this has to do with interdependence became a real sort of conundrum for me. And the disjunction is simply the way we search for new images. Your left breast I name horsetail. She has the power to heal ancestral wounds. The right breast's marsh marigold, pleasure and joy. Each plant has a hydrological aspect, sun and soil crucial, but how they use water defines them. If the slope gradient's steep, The water drains quickly. Give the book too much emotion, it cannot survive. People these days muddy the passions, stir up froth on the surface. The poem that holds something back can go far into history. If you study the ridgeline, you'll see earth ripple with ling. A good hunter never lets anyone touch his tools, his bow, his arrows, his spear. Thus are pens guarded, the notebooks and keyboards with masks. D.D. Kosambi says vagura, trap or snare, can refer to a writer. Antler researches one path. Her breasts are like birdsong, another. Standing near the origin of things, all creatures, rocks, trees, the moon, the river, speak a common language. Here you don't do things for just any old reason. You respect things. You don't break off a branch. You don't crush a leaf. Even in dream, her breasts are two songs of one bird. Girls shouldn't go kicking around bear shit. Jump over it, taunt it. That's crazy behavior way past the limits. Hahoke. A kind of crazy knowledge lies out there to find out the actual shape of our lives, the far high mountains, origins of poetry. No, you don't just go out and talk trash to a grizzly. The name bear is already a ritual distortion, the brown one, the sinewy one. With a heart like a clear spring, should you go to the edge of the berry patch, should you step over the rim, heart like clear water, call uwu, the perilous weave of double this, double that, is a poem for girls who play hand game. September in Shadow Canyon, bear droppings, plum pits, choke cherries. The trail winds through pines to Bear Peak. Young women making the climb. Double, double this, double, double that. Squawberry, crabapple seeds, plum pits. Something tasting like lemongrass. Double this, double that. Black choke cherry, red serviceberry. Double, double this, that. How many of you played double, double this, that when you were a child? So a few of you know that. Yeah. What if you were a writer? Do you jump over the dictionary, insult etymologies, go looking for trouble or make fun of meanings? Here's a world where knowledge brings trouble. Words have a life of their own, each a tiny imageous poem. I blow across etymologies like girls who jump over bear shit. That little sequence refers to a lot of lore about the trouble people get into if they insult bears, who understand our language, and made me think quite a bit about what as writers we do with some of this old lore. These songs without talent, beneath their poisonous phonetics, may they carry prayer and good medicine. Our voices, our subtle human rhythms, can we be generous, cook for each other? Were we, as some say, brought from the soil for this purpose? Can we speak to animals, treat our young with respect? It's true we throw fabulous parties. So that's all from a sequence of poems that ended up Well, it really began because the Scottish poet Alec Finlay asked me for a 10-line poem that had to do with the mountains I live among. And I wrote the 10-line poem, and I thought this was fun, and I wrote more, and then it just began to take off, and in the end it turned out to be 108 poems, which consequentially is a sacred number in many traditions. Hinduism 108, Buddhism 108, the Buddhist mala has 108 beads on it. Other traditions too, I'm told that astronomers think of 108 as an important number because the Earth is supposed to be 108 times the diameter of the sun from the sun. And then maybe the most esoteric of all is 108 is the number of stitches on a baseball. The chickens are my eyes. They see things long before I do. With the bobcat, I knew something was up. They alert me to owl, coyote, elk, deer. The university swollen with demigods, hirelings Blake called them. Snakes, hawks, eagle, etc. Much more afraid of predatory birds than coyotes or wildcats. Balance sheets, budgets, contribution to overhead, the savage crowding at the trough, boardrooms and branding, everything branded. Is this the new guise of corporeal warfare? Of the classroom, little gets said. Wars, wars, endless and costly, Ezra Pound, started by men who couldn't construct a decent chicken coop. A group of us yesterday, about 20 masks, laid Allen Ginsberg's ashes into a marble reliquary at 8,000 feet. I have felt no greater absence in these United States than Ginsberg's, who kept pointing his hand that good poetry is best politics, good scripture is poetry, that our poems are all the scripture we need. Tiny, pink, mottled, marbled Dharma lion tomb, a hall of forgiveness in everyone. Sedimentary rock, windy pines, how much love, 2 fistfuls of ash. An Irish oatmeal tin holds Allen's ash, granular bits of cinder and white bone flecks, wind driving out of the west, the swish of ponderosa limbs, Shelley's West Wind ode. Smell Allen's ashes, and pass the open can around, inhaling the no fragrance, final breath teaching, grand breath, master poesy. If you walk the divide, you might want to build your life from the geology handbook. The faithfulness of things, calls Tim Hogan from ahead on the trail. A rig and the Gulf explodes. Oil plume 100 miles long, Indus watershed floods. 7 million people displaced Pakistan. Teach us turn breath into kindness, grand breath, master poesy. No secret the gods, the forces of nature turn whimsical, cruel. Only breath into kindness see us through. Thank you. Thank you. And if not, I'd be glad to chat with people afterwards. I have a few copies of my books if anybody would like them on the back table here. And other than that, I'd like to say thanks for being such an attentive audience, and really, really good to be here.